She didn't emasculate you. She resurrected someone you buried long ago. Not the man you pretend to be, but the boy still trapped inside you, unseen, unheard, unfathered. You thought you were in love, but you were in regression. Because her presence didn't complete you, it exposed you to the fractures, the silence, the inner child still waiting to be chosen. Carl Jung warned us, when the masculine ego is unformed, the psyche collapses backward, not into madness, into memory, into the first emotional wound that was never healed, only hidden. That's why she feels so powerful, not because she is, but because you aren't fully here. You're still reacting from a time when affection was conditional, and your worth depended on someone else's mood. This isn't about her. It's about the psychological blueprint you keep mistaking for intimacy. The part of you still chasing a mother in the arms of a lover, still hoping love will fix what boyhood broke. But what if the reason she makes you feel like a child is because you've never stopped being one? He handed her the crown before she ever asked to wear it, and then called her queen when she started giving orders. But that wasn't power. It was vacancy. She walked into a throne room you abandoned, and you mistook your absence for her dominance. A man's authority isn't stolen, it's surrendered, bit by bit, every time he bends to avoid silence. She didn't ask you to kneel. You just never learned to stand. When her gaze became gospel, your spine became myth. That's not love, that's worship born of a fracture. Jung called it regression. When the ego is hollow, the boy returns. The one who once begged for praise, the one who feared punishment. She triggered that boy, not because she was cruel, but because you were unclaimed. And you fell, not because she pushed, but because you never built the floor. Your collapse wasn't an accident. It was an ancient echo. The moment her approval became sacred, you stopped being sovereign. Every message you didn't send, every truth you swallowed, was a prayer to be kept. But no woman can sanctify what a man refuses to define, and no intimacy survives where self-abandonment thrives. She seemed commanding because you stopped commanding yourself. You felt weak, not because she was strong, but because your voice was missing. Remember the time she tested you and you laughed instead of drawing a line? That wasn't kindness. That was fear, wearing politeness like a mask. And it cost you more than you ever admitted. The truth? You didn't love her. You needed her to validate your unspoken worth, and when she didn't, you collapsed again, not into her arms, into your silence. That silence that always says, if I speak, she'll leave. But real men speak, and let what must leave go. She didn't emasculate you. You did that to yourself. Every time you avoided a confrontation, every time you performed instead of embodied. She didn't want a boy who obeys. She wanted a man who reigns. Here's the final blade. You weren't weak. You were simply unclaimed. And the woman you feared losing. She was never the threat. Your own silence was. You called it passion, but your nervous system called it déjà vu. The yelling, the silence, the sudden sweetness after the storm. It felt alive, because calm felt foreign. And chaos felt like home. You weren't addicted to her. You were addicted to the emotional high that mirrored your first heartbreak. The one you never named because it wore your mother's face. That craving for peace through conflict. That belief that suffering earns you love. She wasn't complex. She was familiar. Jung warned, what is unhealed becomes holy. You didn't understand her. You recognized her. Not in this life, but in the labyrinth of your past. The same patterns dressed in different perfume. You kept calling her mystery, but she was just inconsistency. You confused being triggered with being seen, because that's what love once meant. Winning affection through compliance, buying presence with your emotional currency. Remember the panic you felt when she pulled away? Not because you lost her, but because you couldn't fix it. That wasn't love. That was reenactment. The boy inside you begging once again, please tell me I'm enough this time. You didn't want her. You wanted to win the battle you lost at age 7, when you cried and no one came, when being good didn't work. So now you fight for love, because receiving it freely feels dishonest. Jung said the shadow loves its own suffering, so you stayed. Not because she healed you, but because the pain felt honest. Because when she yelled, you knew what to do. But when she was soft, you felt like an imposter. You weren't in a relationship. You were in a repetition. She wasn't your partner. She was your past in high definition. And the longer you stayed, the more you mistook the wound for the woman. Before she ever touched you, you were already falling. Not in love, into dependency. Because a man without internal form will always mold to someone else. She didn't become your center. She revealed that you didn't have one, and you clung to her not because she was strong, but because you were hollow. There was no home inside you, so when she offered comfort, you built a temple around it. You called her safe, you called her sacred, but it wasn't her warmth you loved. It was your own absence disappearing. For a moment you forgot the void. Jung warned, the unindividuated man becomes prey to the feminine's gravity. She didn't drag you down. She filled a space you refused to dignify. That aching silence at night. That stare into your own reflection that always asked, who are you without her? You never answered it, so she became the answer. Every plan revolved around her. Every decision softened to keep her calm. You stopped leading your life and started orbiting hers. And when she pulled back, your whole identity trembled because your spine was borrowed. She didn't seduce you. She simply existed where your purpose should have been. That's why her opinion mattered more than your own instincts. You feared her disapproval more than you feared betraying yourself. And you called that compromise. It was collapse. You feared losing her, not because she was your future, but because she distracted you from your own nothingness. That silence you've never sat with, that ache you've always medicated with work, women, or wine. She wasn't a partner. She was anesthesia. A real man doesn't need her warmth to function. He brings fire into the relationship. He builds a structure, and she adds beauty to it. But you didn't build anything. You waited for her to make your life feel meaningful. You weren't consumed by love. You were consumed by avoidance. Avoidance of responsibility, of self-definition, of solitude. She wasn't too much. You were too little where it mattered most. You didn't want a lover. You wanted to be held like a child, to be seen without effort, to be forgiven without explanation. She didn't mother you because she's nurturing. She mothered you because you never stopped crawling. There's a difference between being loved and being soothed, and you weren't looking for love. You were starving for correction, for someone to wrap you in warmth and say, you don't need to grow, just stay. But she couldn't do that forever, and you resented her when she stopped. Jung's anima, the inner feminine you repressed, became the goddess you chased. But she wasn't divine. She was just patient until she wasn't. You projected your salvation onto her smile and blamed her when she stopped healing what wasn't her wound. You didn't fall in love. You fell into infantilization. The boy in you whispered, maybe she'll finally raise me. And when she asked for a man, you panicked because you never became one. Remember how you crumbled when she asked for space? Not because you feared her absence, but because without her, you felt like no one. That's not romantic. That's regression. You never stood up because you were still learning how to walk. She became your emotional home because you had none. And when she withdrew, your world collapsed. Not because she broke you, but because you placed your wholeness in her hands and called it love. She was never the cure. She was the trigger. She reminded you of the work you refused to do, the internal structure you never forged, the emotional independence you kept postponing. The woman you need, the one who can stand beside you. She can't arrive while you still crawl through relationships begging to be rescued. She doesn't want a boy. She doesn't want to nurture you through avoidance. She wants a man who's already stood in his own fire and walked out. You thought you were being loving, but really you were shape-shifting. shrinking to fit her frame, contorting to avoid her silence. She never asked you to vanish, but you did it anyway. Because a man without inner law will obey anything that feels like connection. You weren't loyal. You were lawless inside. Every time she changed the terms, you agreed. Not out of trust, but out of fear. The fear that if you finally drew a line, she'd walk away. And you'd be left alone with yourself, the one you never learned to stand beside. Jung taught that without a sovereign ego, the soul leaks, and that's exactly what happened. You bled energy trying to please her moods. Every yes that felt like a no left another scar on your self-respect. And still you smiled. She didn't train you. You trained yourself to anticipate her emotional weather, to read her tone like a sacred scripture, to become useful instead of truthful. And you called it emotional intelligence. Masculinity without inner structure becomes servitude. Not because the world is cruel, but because the man becomes a ghost in his own house. You didn't just lose her. You lost your reflection in the mirror. You kept peace by abandoning war. But some wars need to be fought, not against her, but against the parts of you that still beg for validation. You feared being alone more than you feared being erased. So you chose comfort over code. She didn't dominate you. She simply walked into a system where there were no rules, so she made them, not out of malice, but out of necessity. And now you resent her for playing a game you refused to define. You weren't loyal, you were homeless. You called her boundaries controlling because you had none to match them. And deep down, you didn't want freedom. You wanted someone to replace the discipline you never claimed. You didn't run because she was dangerous. You stayed because her danger felt familiar. She didn't devour you. She awakened the part of you that wanted to be consumed, not by her, but by something ancient, powerful, and forbidden, your own shadow. Jung's projection is cruel like that. What you refuse to see in yourself, you'll meet in others. She wasn't your captor, she was your mirror. She showed you your own hunger for domination, seduction, and collapse. And you blamed her for it. You didn't fear her darkness. You feared recognizing your own, the part of you that wants control, while pretending to be a victim, the rage that sleeps beneath the politeness, the shame that you dress as virtue. You called her toxic, but only after she exposed the poison in you. That's why you stayed past the warning signs, because on some level, the chaos felt just, like a sentence you'd been waiting to serve. She didn't hunt you. You walked willingly into her mouth. You thought, if you let her devour you, maybe the pain would make sense, maybe collapse would feel like truth, because being seen was too exposing. But being broken, that felt manageable. The man who avoids his shadow becomes a slave to hers. You didn't lose yourself to her power. You lost yourself to the power you never claimed, and she wore it because someone had to. That's why her presence both attracted and terrified you. She didn't destroy your structure. She simply walked through the door you left unlocked, because part of you wanted to watch it burn and say, "See, I told you I was unlovable." That's not romance. That's martyrdom with a script. You weren't devoured by her. You were swallowed by your own unclaimed instinct. The part of you that still believes strength is dangerous, that still fears being whole. But here's the truth. The monster in the mirror was always wearing your face. Did you enjoy the content and it made a difference for you? Click on Super Thanks and support our work. You told yourself it was love, but it was thirst, disguised as connection. You didn't desire her softness. You needed it, because you never gave it to yourself, and now every touch felt like redemption for a need you were shamed for. There's a kind of hunger that doesn't roar, it whispers. A quiet ache for affection, buried under layers of pride. She became the oasis not because she healed you, but because you never allowed your own need to speak. So it spoke through craving. Jung warned that what we repress returns through attraction, and you repressed your vulnerability so deeply it re-emerged as obsession, not with her, but with what she symbolized: mercy, permission, relief. You begged in silence. She didn't hear it, but she felt it. And eventually it became too heavy for her to carry. Not because she was cruel, but because your need was never hers to mother. It was yours to name. You weren't in love. You were starving through her. The shame you felt after sex, it wasn't about lust. It was about using closeness as anesthesia. The man who denies his wounds becomes addicted to women who bandage them poorly. You didn't want her attention. You wanted her to fix a story she didn't write. One that began long before she arrived. One where you learned that need equals weakness. You called it masculine to not ask for much. But inside, you were raging to be held. Not physically, symbolically. To have someone say, "You don't need to earn love by bleeding for it." But she couldn't give you that because you never gave it to yourself. You weren't weak. You were unmothered. And the boy in you kept choosing women not to love, but to repair. That's not intimacy. That's exile in disguise. It wasn't her strength that led the way. It was your fear of abandonment. You didn't want a leader. You just feared what solitude might say. So you followed quietly into dependency. You feared the echo more than the argument, the quiet room more than the shouting match, because emptiness felt like death. And you mistook her presence for protection, but it wasn't safety. It was sedation. Jung said, "Individuation begins where codependency dies, but death always demands a price." And for you, the price was sovereignty. You sold your decision-making for reassurance, your direction for her attention. She didn't break you. Your avoidance of solitude did. You let her think for you, feel for you, dream for you. Not because you lacked intellect, but because your soul still feared being left behind. She didn't want to lead. She had to, because you never took the throne. You made her the sun of your emotional orbit, and then blamed her when you lost your way. But truthfully, you just never built your own compass. You chose company over clarity and called it love. But love isn't compliance out of fear. Love is choosing to stay, not needing to. You weren't a partner. You were a shadow with a heartbeat. Every time you swallowed your truth to avoid being alone, you taught your soul that silence is survival. And now, that silence echoes in every failed connection. You never asked, "What do I want?" because you were always too busy asking, "Will she stay?" The final boyhood wound is this: choosing belonging over truth, choosing noise over sovereignty. You didn't need her leadership. You needed your own spine to return from exile. You thought the wound was her leaving, but the real pain was realizing you never truly arrived. You keep asking, "Why did she do this to me?" But the better question is, why did I abandon myself for her warmth? Because it was never about her. It was about the parts of you that still believe being chosen equals being whole. So here's the silence you've been avoiding. You don't need her touch. You need your own breath, steady, sovereign, and unforgivingly honest. This isn't about forgetting her. It's about remembering who you were before she became your shelter. Before you turned love into a strategy for survival. What would it mean to stop chasing validation and start building self-trust? What if everything you were looking for in her was just what you abandoned in yourself? The soul doesn't evolve through comfort. It evolves through confrontation, and yours is long overdue. Subscribe, turn on the notifications, and keep walking this path of brutal self-knowledge and emotional resurrection. Before you walk away from her, ask yourself this: was she the problem tool, or was she the mirror? In the next video, we dive deeper into what she truly awakens in you, not to escape her, but to finally understand yourself.